You may not be aware of it. Dennis is the master of making up a theme for a year. And at the end of the year, we said, that was brilliant. How did you do that? This one, Windows into Beauty and Meaning, is a dandy, I think, and all the programs relate to that. But Ken Diener, who's going to speak today, his topic is the perfect initial one for this theme. Because we're talking about, many people didn't realize, the role of poetry and architecture in the garden. It's not in our culture that a garden is about plants, so the idea that poetry, but here to talk about the poetry of Chinese architecture is to bring those two together in a wonderful way. You should know that Ken and Amy came to Portland in 1990 and immediately got involved in the garden. Ken participated in the program, and Donald Jenkins and Jan Quibby, and it was a blessing for those of us who participated. He's been a docent since day one, and has had his own architecture practice since 1993. So his investment in the garden, and his understanding of architecture, the poetry of architecture, it's a wonderful way to start a program. Ken Diener.
Thank you. So I'd like to start by thanking Dennis, not only for the topic, which blended perfectly with where I was headed. Some of you were at my lecture, it turns out almost 3 years ago, December of '08, it turns out. I was looking back through my files. It's unbelievable how fast that goes. And following that lecture, I sort of been thinking about what to do for lecture number 2, and it had been fermenting for a while. And so Dennis, asked me to do the lecture for today, starting back about 5 or 6 months ago, and so it's been fermenting for a while. And so one of the wonderful things about this process is actually going from, okay, 5, 6 months ago, even 3 years ago, I had a concept about what I would do. This forces you to have a deadline, a date, say, okay, I'm going to put this all together for this moment, and so it's a very interesting exercise to have to process it that way. For those of you who read Dennis's email introduction, masterful paragraph introducing what poetry in architecture is, I definitely appreciated that. I thought it was a really good introduction. And when we talk about poetics of architecture, there is, we can talk about the poetry of the Chinese garden, but when we do, as a broader topic, we'd like to talk about poetry. Let's make sure this whole thing is working here. Okay. We got to the point of the screen and the projector. Let's see here. From the beginning, let's try it again.
Did you want the podium turned?
Here we go. Okay, so when I talk about the poetry of architecture, definitely brings up probably one of the most interesting books written for in the Western civilization for architecture, and that's The Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard, who was a French mathematician and philosopher. I think he taught at Sorbonne, but he was French in the 1950s, and he wrote this book and came out in the early 60s. And without ever crossing into Asian concepts or architecture, he talks about this poetics of space. And if you look at the contents, he talks about all kinds of, these are the chapters, things that occur directly in the garden. And Charles Wu, in his book, that many of you know, Listen to the Fragrance, talks about, and we talk about, the idea of hut, house and universe, miniatures, intimacy, and roundness comes up in a lot of the symbolism. So this book takes us on a journey from the cellar to the attic, and talks about how houses and shelters shape our thoughts, memories, and dreams. And it's really powerful that way. This is a little quote from this this chapter here, Miniatures, and completely ties into the whole idea of Taoism. And many of you know the first quote of the garden about experiencing the garden as very large and very small, a very classic Taoist concept. And thus the minuscule or narrow gate opens up the entire world. The details of the thing can be the sign of a new world, which, like all worlds, contains the attributes of greatness. Miniatures is one of the refugees of greatness. And he wrote that in terms of Western miniaturism, modeling, and so forth. And so it's amazing the parallels there. It's working out. So a couple of quotes taken from the first chapter. And the house is one of the greatest powers of integration for the thoughts, memories, and dreams of mankind. And he talks about, you don't just experience a room or a house. You talk about reading a room, or writing a room, or reading a house. And so, we all think about the garden this way instinctively, but one of the greatest reasons why our garden is so powerful is that the idea of a house is a wonderful way of getting into the dreams, the psyche, the desires of man. And so when you talk about that, one of the things that I start my lecture off with, and when I do my tours, is this idea of the goal that the dreams and desires of the scholar owner of the garden, is that the goal of the garden should be to recreate the journey of a scroll painting. And this is a quote taken talking about scroll paintings, but as you listen to this, you can see it could be either painting or architecture. They are expressions of the mind and heart of the individual artist cultivating landscapes that embody the culture and cultivation of their masters. And so whether it's the painting or the building, I carry this reproduction of this painting with me for all my tours. This painting, and we'll come back to this, for me is the great embodiment of the garden and of the concept of the scholar's garden. It's from Lake Chen from the 10th century, and we'll talk about it in more detail. But one of the reasons why, there's all kinds of excellent ideas about this painting. For those of you who were with me on the last lecture, one of the things just formally I found out when I was looking at this painting is, bizarrely, this is probably the most famous piece of American architecture, Falling Water. And you start looking at the composition of this famous image of falling water, and you start looking at the painting of Lake Chen, Solitary Temple of Mid-Current Peaks. We got mountain home here. We have intermediate waterfalls. We have a secondary pool, another pool, a waterfall here, the receiving pond here and here. The water flows here and off the painting, water flows here and off the image. It's bizarre. It's just how similar it is, and it just sort of speaks to, there's something inherent in this landscape and in why we think of that house as probably the masterpiece of American architecture. But getting back to this idea of desires and goals, the best way to glimpse into the inner desire of a wealthy patriarch is to look to see what they did, how they build their master suite. So for good or bad, here is Master Suite circa 2000. Right? And that's why we all cringe, is because that really is the symbol of American ideal desire, if you want to call it, in some places. Obviously somebody spent a lot of money and effort coming up with that, and this is their ideal place. If you think about it, the home is an overall image, but the master suite is the place that the master can control his world. And so what the master of the house decides to do is an outlook into his ultimate desires and dreams. So year 2000, if you go back to 100 years, this is the Vanderbilt house. This is called the Breakers. And this is his master suite. And his brother and his sister-in-law had a house downtown Newport, this is Newport, Rhode Island, called the Marble home. And on the coast of the Marble, she actually built a Chinese tea house. And I think it is open to the public. These are all National Register places open in Newport now. So it's sort of interesting, a little looping tying in. So that's Master Suite 1900. Oops. Let's see if I can go back. But anyway, so let's go back in time to 1490, Suzhou. One of the interesting things about Suzhou, obviously these are romantic canals, but you've seen these outside walls. It doesn't tell you that much about the people inside, and that's really part of the goal, part of the idea. We all know that there are things going on behind this wonderful image. One of the things our garden does, and I talked about it in my tour, is that we stripped away all the intensity of the issues of courtyard life up in here, and we built just the garden portion. And so as part of the garden portion, and I talk about like the tea house, would be the equivalent of maybe that pavilion overlooking the garden, or that two-story building overlooking the garden. But looking at the actual garden portion itself, here's an image of Master of the Fishnets, which is probably our closest sister garden. It's almost exactly the same size as our garden. We talk about it as sort of like the one that's closest to our garden. And if you look at the Master Suite of Master of the Fishnets, number 5 here is called the Five Summits Reading Hut. And it's very interesting. Again, look at the word hut. 5 summits, and so that's the Scholar's Garden, Scholar's Study. And this is another interesting study. This is a study for viewing paintings. So he sort of has two different places there. That's the Scholar's Study right up in here, overlooking the lake and so forth. And one of the interesting things about this idea of the term, the Five Summits Reading Hut, is the idea that the term Five Summits relates back to 2200 BCE, the Shun ruler of China from back then, and he used to make a journey every 5 years to the 5 summits. And it was the early beginnings of the idea of mountains and pilgrimages. So this, and again, one of the things I have to say is I'm not a linguist, I've never studied Chinese, but one of the things when you're talking about poetry and my pronunciations is going to be off, but Zhaosheng Jinjiang, which means paying one's respect to a mountain. And so this talks about seeing rocks in a garden as an invitation to make a mental journey to these sacred mountains. And that's the actual name of his Master Suite, his Scholar's, is that desire. But getting back to our garden, this is a painting in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But this is sort of the ideal of the scholar. This is what he would like to build, or this is how he would like to see himself. Let's call it that. Sitting on a mountain, overseeing the clouds. Here's his residence, and it's a wonderful poem that he's thinking and reading to himself up there. But in our garden itself, there's the entrance into the Master Suite, and as you know, we call it the poetic name for our Master Suite is the Celestial Hall of Permeating Fragrance. But that hall in our Scholar Study exists within a status. These were the 400 wealthiest families of Suzhou in the 1490s. That's why I talked about the Vanderbilts and so forth. And it's definitely, the study in our garden exists within the status of the society. One of the things I talked about 3 years ago was this idea of the 3, 5, 7, and 9 column hall. And the 3 column hall is a peasant's farmhouse. The 5 column hall might be a merchant. Our garden is based on a 7 column hall, and only the emperor has a 9 column hall. And these are showing different spatial arrangements that you can develop based on 3, 5, 7, 9 columns. And so one of the things that you see in our 7 column hall is that there's always this little side bay. And it's always very interesting to see how the side bay is either incorporated into it or separate from it. Sometimes it's a circulation zone, sometimes it's a secondary space or something like that. So here's our 7 column hall. And when I say 7, you've got column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And for instance, not only is it based on the status of the society, but also within our own garden, every pavilion is based on a hierarchy. So starting from the Zhuan room might be the bottom status of the hierarchy of our garden. Hall of Brocaded Clouds is the ultimate status, the living room, the master of the house. The scholar study is number 2. And so I'm going to throw up a couple of images of just that little side bay. And let's see if you sort of get an idea of, this is side bays throughout the garden. And you can see how the complexity and the detailing and the space becomes more enriched and so forth. And so, there's a way of so that is actually the scholar's study. There's very subtle differences between it and the Hall of Brocaded Clouds, but if you start looking at it, it is there. Notice in the scholar's study, this little transom is solid ginkgo, and it has a very similar ornamented bracket system and this sort of reverse keystone holding up this queen's post, basically. And there's a little plinth up here, and you notice it's sort of filled in with the ornament here, whereas Hall of Brocaded Clouds, you can see there's a whole other layer there on top, and the arch is a little bit higher, and there's windows here in the transom, and the bracket system, as it comes from this arch versus the scholar's study, extends further, and there's a whole other bracket that extends further out. So there's subtle differences in that hierarchy as well.
Do you point out these details when you're giving a tour?
No.
To me, you do.
That's why she doesn't go. But if you go to the name of the hall, the Celestial Hall of Permeating Fragrance, notice when Charles did these translations for us, were the celestial hall and not the hut. The hut is the traditional idea of the humble way of expressing a room. But if you talk about the name of the Celestial Hall, we get into this character right here, and what is explained is that this is the human radical, and this is the mountain radical. And when you combine those two, that creates celestial together. Human and mountain together become celestial, and that is what makes our hall a celestial hall and not a hut. Right? It's very subtle, but that's the aspect of linguistics and how in the perception of your space is different. Getting into the idea of what a master suite is like. Once you start looking around the scholar's study, there's all kinds of details, interesting aspects. There's all kinds of little miniature carvings in the non-wood paneling. For a long time, you sort of gloss over it. It's like being in a museum and there's too many images, and you say, okay, well, I'll deal with it later, and you never really look that carefully. But this is sort of cool. This is in the carvings of the non-wood chrysanthemum, which is the big flower that represents the hermit scholar, because it blossoms on its own late in the fall season. And these are fly swatters, basically. And the fly swatter relates to, you've all probably heard of the 8 Immortals, and we'll talk about the link of the 8 Immortals in the philosophies of Chinese culture. But one of the 8 Immortals, Lu Dongbin, he's known for his fighting abilities and his drinking, which is cool, sort of interesting. But he also carries a fly whisk, which he uses to walk on clouds, fly to heaven, and sweep away ignorance. Right? And so this ties into exactly the paintings, the names of the garden, and everything else that we'll talk about here. Flying to heaven and clouds, and this is obviously the ideal of the garden, and the scholar's study is sweeping away ignorance. So it's a really cool little link. Obviously, the space itself, when I'm doing my tours, I always talk about sort of a Jabba the Hutt scene, where you imagine the guy's been hanging out with his big old pillow and his quilt and his goat board and his books. And, I sort of jokingly talk about his to the scholar study, and that's the scholar's desk, which Dennis and Francis and a lot of you have. I call it Williamsburg it up to put artifacts in there so we could we experience that space as a Ming Dynasty scholar. And so here you are sitting at the desk as a Ming Dynasty scholar, and you've got all these dry ink brushes, and you're trying to say, okay, now what am I going to do? We all sit at desks, right? And one of the things I love about this room is there's a little scholar stone up there on the top of the bookcase. And the way I like to think of the scholar stone is, about you guys, but I've got Google Earth and Google Image on my computer, and you sit there, at your desk thinking that you're going to get work done. And how many of you actually click on Google Earth and I think I'm going to look at the house I lived in Australia, and zoom in, and then it's like, God, I really want to see a picture of Minsk, and you click on Google Image Minsk, and you get lost for 20 minutes. 500 years ago, you didn't have that luxury of killing time that way, so you would stare up at this stone and get lost in the mountains. And so that scholar stone is sort of his procrastination device, to look up at that mountain, get lost, and hopefully get inspired. So a little test for you guys. Here's another scholar stone in the garden. You guys know where that stone is?
Tea house.
Yeah. Just a couple of you got it. On the landing in the tea house going up between the first and second floor. It's a really wonderful little guy. And it's been there since the beginning. It's a great scholar stone. And then going back to our stone here, which is stepping into the clouds. And which is the title of the lecture, but it's also the name of this rock. And stepping into the clouds is actually Jing. And it's actually a common saying, which is a compliment on a successful scholar's continuous ascent into the higher echelons of officialdom. And so, when I talk about it in the garden, doing my tours, is rising up through your scholarly studies. And then as you pull back through the window, above the window is the name of the view, and there's actually a very interesting saying. It's an actual saying in Chinese. I guess you pronounce it "duhua." Duhua, or read the landscape. And so read the landscape is a classic. It's just a classic saying. One of the things that is sort of neat about this plaque is it's written, sculpted on stone that looks like a Chinese scroll. And so, it's shaped like a silk scroll to suggest reading a landscape painting on a handheld scroll. So it's different than the other plaques that are in the garden. So, so we talked about going back to our painting. Read the painting. So obviously there's all kinds of ways of reading the painting. One of the ways, obviously, one of the things in terms of Chinese painting is actually reading the painting, and there's all kinds of chops and interesting things on the painting, and there's all kinds of philosophical ways of reading the painting that we'll talk about in a second. But again, getting into reading this painting, Solitary Temple of the Clearing Peaks, I got on the phone and started talking with Ling Li, who is the assistant curator of the Nelson Atkins Museum. And this painting, which I consider the Mona Lisa of Chinese paintings, it's 1,000 years old. It's probably one of the finest paintings in my mind of all time, and it's sitting in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, and it's not on display. And so I called her up, and I was like, so what's the story with this painting? She said, well, it's 1,000 years old. It's very fragile. It is probably one of the most valuable paintings in the world. It's actually going to Shanghai on loan for about 9 months next year. They're working very hard to make sure the transfer goes well. And in terms of reading this painting, obviously there's a story of how a fragile silk painting gets to Kansas City over 1,000 years. So I said, how did the Nelson Atkins Museum get this painting? And she said, well, our curator in the 1930s went to China, and with the funds from the Nelson Foundation, started buying paintings in the 1930s. And he bought this painting from an Italian collector who was in Japan. And so they're incredible. They in the Cleveland Museum of Art have two of the finest Asian art collections in the United States. And it's based on this curator who went to China before World War II, thankfully, and luckily bought these fragile paintings. And we may not have ever had this painting, if they hadn't gotten through the war. So and she said, it's a little hard to read because of the light, but she said the most famous is this renowned collector, Liang Jingbao, from 1620 to 1691, who owned the collection of the best quality paintings of the time. And that's the second chop down here. But she said the most important one is this very, very faded chop up here, which is actually the Emperor's chop from the Song Dynasty. And so this was actually in the Song Dynasty collection, and so that's the 12th century. So that was about 200 years after it was painted, 150 years, somewhere about that. But what was interesting about the Song Dynasty is, and Li Chen, as you're starting to read the history, so there it pops up, is that the fall of the Tang Dynasty, and I sort of did all this research about the painting. The fall from dynasty to dynasty usually is not smooth. There was a lot of upheaval from the Tang. The Song Dynasty was the beginning, and this is why it's important for us, is the sort of beginning of the scholar officials. The scholars' exams, the scholar officials, that these men, and this is this quote, the men extol the virtues of self-cultivation, often in response to political setbacks. So there's a lot of, as you all know, when you're backing one horse and the horse changes, you can obviously get into trouble. So there's a lot of back and forth there, but this is sort of interesting where the setbacks in the political career can be inserted through their identity through literature, poetry, music, calligraphy, and the style of painting that employed calligraphic brushworks. And one of the finest painters from this Song Dynasty is Li Chen. His ancestors were from the Tang Dynasty, imperial family, and obviously out of favor and so forth. Became an artist, and Li Chen, Feng Huan, and however you pronounce Wang Huan, together became known as the three great Bible artists. They're known for this technique that's treating ink like gold, which gives the appearance of being in a foggy dream. And Li Chen, based on that painting and others, was considered probably one of the greatest landscape painters of all time. And so, essentially, I don't know for sure, but I sort of imagine, and the emperor of the Song Dynasty during that time was a great patron of the arts, and he thought of himself as a painter as well. And I don't know for sure, but I sort of imagine these guys as sort of being a stable of artists, sort of like how Da Vinci was in a stable with emperors, and these were funded. You pony up to the emperor because they could fund the lifestyle you need to be as an artist. And so that's how that painting got into the Song Dynasty collection. But as you go in deeper into reading the painting, go back to a lecture, I think it was about 5 years ago, from the designer of the garden, and I forget his name. Anybody remember his name? The lead designer of the garden who was here 5 years ago.
Mr. Kwong.
And I remember from his lecture a really interesting quote. He said that the ideal of Lake Zither, our lake, the true goal of our lake, is not really realized until the light of the moon is like shimmering in its surface, was his quote. And I was like, I remember that quote, and that, it's a really loaded quote. It was very masterful in what he said there. And once you start getting into this idea, the ultimate value of our lake is really not realized until the light of the moon is like shimmering in its surface. You get into, and most of us know, and what we talk about in our trainings is homonyms, and we talk about homonyms. But as you get into homonyms, there's some interesting things. There's homophones, which are the actual exact words, like run and run, right? Run a race and run your stocking. Spelled the same way, said the same way. Heteronyms is words that are spelled the same way, but it's pronounced differently. So like when we talk about the homonym of fish, and most of us know it when we do our tours, the homonym fish is you, and you is, prosperity and so forth. We talk about, we've done some research, there's over 254 different English words for the word you, for the word fish and you. But it's actually a heteronym because there's you pronounce you like 11 or 12 different ways in Chinese, and it means different things. And so most of us non-Chinese speaking people that involved with the garden, I'll talk about it in general for myself, homonyms are something we learn and we really embrace. But one of the things that that's also going on is what's called rebuses. And rebuses are the literal constructions of, like what we talk about, the human and the mountain becomes a celestial. The rebus is a pictogram. An example that illustrates a pictogram is I can see you. This is an English thing, right? And so when you put those together, that becomes a whole other word, right? And these are 4 words. You could draw that with a human eye, a metal can, the C, and a U goat, right? And that would make I can see you. And some linguists believe that the Chinese developed their writing system according to the rebus principle. And so when you start doing that and you start looking at all these poetics of things, you have gold and water and lace and the moon and shimmering and surface. And you can talk about all the different puns and homonyms. But one of the interesting things down here is that in Chinese mythology, water was the accumulated cold air of the yin, and the vapors originated from the moon. The moon was the essence of water and was the spirit in charge of the water. Therefore, the extended meaning of a moon on ancient Chinese coins was that the money should circulate just like the flowing, gushing, rising water. Right? And so we talk about the water and the fish as prosperity, but it's linked in that rebus. So, it goes into dragons, and, let's see, water animal, relief of exhale in the wind and the summit, and so there's a whole series of dragon symbolism, obviously, as well as the dragon fish, and it also, again, gets to the idea that money should flow like waters and stars. And so then we get into the goldfish again. The fish with you, with the homonym, you and you is the same word, but goldfish, the word yin, and you together also means abundance and jade or surplus. And so again, that's this rebus where the 2 words, and again, without being a Chinese speaker, you wouldn't really realize that the double words combine to make these other things. And so this carp, and so as you guys know, we have, I think, 11 new koi in the garden. They're huge. They're almost like watching puppy dogs play. I've always talked to everybody, and for the last 10 years, people ask, why don't you have koi? And I said,